Welcome to another episode of the Calgary Fitness Podcast. I'm with Calvin Zaryski, a high performance endurance coach, and we had the chance to kind of connect just offline. And I learned a little bit more about you. But why don't you give the listeners and the people watching just an idea of who you are and kind of a 50-foot overview?
You bet. Hey, Justin, thanks for having me on your podcast. I've heard a lot of good things about this, so I'm excited to be a part of this. Yeah, I mean, I guess I grew up in the Okanagan, Penticton, BC, and from there I was an active kid running around playing soccer. I was a good runner, and sort of I've evolved into this endurance athlete. The Okanagan was the sort of the hot spot for triathlons back in the 80s. And I saw this sort of triathlon thing go down, and I thought, wow, that's something I want to give it a go. And that's how I got launched into multi-sport stuff. And as I grew up in Penticton, I eventually moved to Calgary. And then when I was in Calgary, I did my undergrad degree at the University of Calgary. And originally, I thought I was going to be a school teacher, but I kind of changed pathways after my degree. I sort of worked at the Eau Claire Y downtown as a weight and fitness technician. And I really found a good love for working with adults when it comes to health and wellness and that functionality of things. And then I decided I kind of wanted to expand that scope a little bit more. And I went back to the University of Calgary and did my master's degree in exercise physiology, and I studied under a brilliant man, Dr. David Smith, who was the head of the department there, as well as the head of the Canadian Sport Institute. And sort of, I gravitated a little bit more into the high performance realm of endurance sport, just to broaden the scope again of the type of athlete that I could work with, not just the general population. I finished that degree, and then I created a company with a partner, Grant Molyneux, called The Coaches Inc. And I think we were one of the first companies to offer sort of a community coaching service, almost in Canada. And we started working with marathoners and triathletes and that sort of thing, and guiding them into performance. If they've signed up for their first ever triathlon, how do we get them there to the start line safely and that sort of thing. And then marathoning back there in the late 80s and 90s was a hot sport. Everyone was running marathons. The passion was to obviously try to qualify for Boston. And so we certainly had to dig out some of our high performance tools to be able to get them to their goals. And then I think it was around the 1980 or 88 or something, 89. I started doing my own work basically with high performance athletes more. And I worked with Mount Everest summiteers and Olympians and Pan American gold medalists and that sort of thing. And so I've sort of been on my own now for 23, 25 years. And that's kind of been my evolution as I've gone through this pathway of working again with athletes in my own personal journey, as well as designing or creating a company to offer that type of service. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. Yeah.
I want to go back a little bit. I mean, when you were a kid and you said you were a good runner, I mean, what kind of kid were you? Were you mischievous? Were you running running away from your parents all the time? Like, talk about how you were growing up.
Yeah, that's funny. Yeah, I was a hyper kid. I mean, I was pretty hard to control. And thankfully, I found a little bit of reprieve for that getting into sport. And I really enjoyed soccer. I actually excelled at that, played on a few elite teams. And I nearly played on the University of Calgary soccer team, but instead, I actually chose to run on the varsity cross country team and track team. So I elected to actually become more of a runner. And then at that time, I started swimming and biking. But yeah, I was a hyper kid. I was always active. I was always doing something. So I definitely found the right pathway in terms of becoming a strong athlete and then eventually becoming a coach, so I can sort of communicate all the lessons and learnings that I personally as an athlete have discovered. And then the beauty about what I've been able to set up for myself is that as a so-called high performance athlete, in combination with the education that I've done and the athletes that I've worked with, having those two sort of components come together it really, I find, excels my coaching, so that I can relate to them on an athletic standpoint, and of course apply a lot of science-based coaching based on whether it's nutrition or the science of recovery and those sort of things. So that's kind of how it is. But yeah, I was a hyper kid. I was running around with my head cut off all the time. You bet.
That's hilarious.
Yeah.
And I want to know too, you mentioned you were kind of helping people, go up Everest. And you said right around that 88, 89. How did the Olympics in Calgary come into play with that? Or did it at all?
Yeah, it did. And normally when you do an undergrad, you kind of choose a different institution to go to sort of work with other professors and that sort of thing. But the Olympic Games in '88, the University of Calgary built an entire high performance lab. It was amazing. They had everything there, and of course the oval was resurrected in there, and so I decided to stay in Calgary and work with some new professors. And as I said, Dr. David Smith was around at the time. And so I was very, very blessed to be able to stay in Calgary, keep the costs down for education, and yet utilize these world-class facilities. And of course, it was drawing world-class coaches as well into Calgary. So we had a tremendous environment for learning. And I just found it a tremendous opportunity to kind of keep pushing the boundaries of the learning about high performance and multi-sport. And then I did my master's degree. And again, I studied triathlon specifically and published a paper on critical power and critical speed as it relates to triathlon. So that was kind of the big kick into the international research side of things. And since then, I've expanded that a little bit. But yeah, University of Calgary was awesome for me.
And what about you now? I mean, are you a family man? Do you have kids? What's home life like?
Yeah, home life. Well, I have a 10-year-old daughter. Her name's Kate, and she's a blast. It's so nice to kind of have that refreshing person, where it brings you back to your youth and that sort of thing. And the concept of, teaching them the basics and the importance of exercise and wellness and nutrition and that sort of thing. But so she obviously takes up quite a bit of my time. She lives with her mom, so I see her 2 or 3 times a week. And then life is busy. When you have, say, a group of 30 athletes, and we're always booking group training, and of course there's program design and that sort of thing. I really am busy all the time. Just like yourself, I suspect you work 7 days a week. I'm the same way. Most of my clients have full access to text me at any time. There's running your own business is busy, but of course there's lots of great perks for that. And the beauty is my occupation, I get to stay fit. I get to actually participate, which I think is a blessing as well. So, we're always doing something. As the winter months hit, we're pretty much ready to go snowshoeing. We're pretty much ready to do anything outside as long as it's not too cold. And yeah, we're really creative in how we train as endurance athletes.
And I'm curious, is Kate following in Dad's footsteps? Has she kind of taken a liking to the performance sports or anything?
Yeah, you know what? She's now on a 4-year triathlon, I guess, momentum. She's done 4 years in a row of doing a triathlon. So she's on this roll, and she actually wants to continue with this. And so I believe it was September long weekend. We went to Lake Bonavista, and she swam 200 meters in the lake. It was a little bit cold. And then we actually jumped on our bikes and we rode 10 kilometers. And then eventually she ran her 2 kilometers. And so she's following a little bit of the footsteps of Dad. However, she's more of an artsy kind of girl, plays the piano, loves artwork and that sort of stuff. And I'm fine with that. But she is understanding that exercise is very important for her development. So, and then I have a little bit of an allowance, and it's an exercise training allowance. For every workout, if it's categorized as a workout, she gets $1. So it kind of gets her over the hump sometimes when she's in that contemplative sort of style of things. Yeah.
Oh, that's really cool. That's awesome to hear. And I love the idea of going in Lake Vista too, like something local, right? It's something that keeps her active and keeps her moving. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
I want to know about the people you're training right now. Like, talk a little bit more about the group training, kind of the business, kind of the meat and potatoes of things.
Yeah, as I said, I specialize more in the endurance client. Again, somebody that's embarking on sort of running 10K, half marathon, triathlons, can go as extreme as doing ultras, Mount Everest again. I've worked with 3 clients that have climbed Mount Everest, and in general, like it's a very finite sort of occupation. I specialize in that, and of course, there's a lot of people out there in this community that are amazing at doing strength and conditioning and that sort of thing. And I think nowadays you sort of need to specialize and certainly know when you want to hand off. It's like, hey, this person would be better for that particular ailment, particularly coming off an injury. So Critical Speed, as I said, has been operating for almost 28 years now, and basically, yeah, it's been a lot of fun. It's been quite a journey, and in essence, it's just moving along. And now the challenges, as you all know, is the COVID issues about keeping safe and keeping people on track. As you know, motivation is an issue for some. It's funny, I'm finding that there are a small group of people that are hyper motivated. They're doing incredible things that are well beyond probably what they ever dreamed of, just with extra time. And then there's another group of people that are struggling just to kind of keep things going on a daily basis. And so I think, as coaches, and you're in the same boat, is how do we kind of communicate with these people and their needs, and identifying what really are their roadblocks.
So at this point, I mean, and the thing is I'm not big in the triathlon scene, but I don't know if there are any events going on right now. Say someone was hoping to start to train for something. And I know it's going to completely depend on people. You have to do an assessment, everything like that. But if someone were to start tomorrow saying, I want to do a full triathlon, where would you direct them? Kind of, is it more the training regimen? Is it more, I'm not sure. You tell me where you would start someone who has never done a triathlon before. Where would they start?
Yeah, and often, I think in your case too, is often most people are not that comfortable with the swim. Now, if they come from a swimming background, that's a bonus, obviously, because there's a lot of work that has to happen there. Obviously, if they're comfortable in the water, great. Then we can start working on maybe body position and the rhythm of breathing and how they're breathing and those sort of things. So that's probably the number one limitations with multi-sport triathloning. So if they're decent at swimming, or if they're actually gone to that next level where they can swim, say, 100 meters, which is 4 lengths of the pool, then at least we're over that initial hump. And then from there, it's a matter of deciding how many days a week are we going to swim. And with swimming, usually it's a frequency thing. So minimum is kind of probably 3 times a week, especially if you're learning, because the more time that you're in the water, working on the subcomponents, as I said, comfortable breathing, body kick, body position, that sort of thing, then we can start developing, again, proper technique. And of course, technique is everything in swimming. So that is a huge focus for someone that's starting out in multi-sports. From there, it's just a matter of saying, well, the cycling is more about establishing the proper equipment. So helping them buy a bike, helping them find a trainer so they can train inside during the winter, and then eventually start working with them on sort of the proper techniques and mechanics of cycling. And there's lots of drills, single leg drills, big gear push pull, standing up, sitting down, those sort of things that we work on. And then the running side, again, is just assessing to see if there's any structural limitations and making sure that they can handle that. If you find that somebody, again, is in a position where they're a lot of overweight, so they're a lot heavier than they normally are, then you have to be very sensitive about how much running, and maybe it's a run-walk program to start off with. If that's a non-issue, then basically you start building, again, the frequency, potentially sprinkle in some intensity in there to, again, get the body strong, the joints, the connective tissue, ligaments, tendons. Of course, the structural limitations are a huge game in this triathloning thing. Once they get strong, then we're in a position where we can maybe balance out, again, the program. Just means that maybe you're going to swim 2 times a week, bike 2 times a week, and run 2 times a week as just a general program. So it does come down to a lot of assessment to find out where the athlete is. But I think, just like yourself, is that much of the attention and I guess the coaching has to come into the swim department for sure.
And I'd have to, like I was telling you before we even started recording, I was trying to train for a triathlon earlier this year. COVID hit, it kind of derailed my training, and I haven't really looked into the event since. But swimming is my weakness. And, I maybe got up to like, I'm not sure even sure what the levels are called growing up, but I think I got into the third level. Like I
Yeah.
feel like I sink every time I swim, and it's just so if it's someone like me where that's my biggest weak point, would you even like increase the frequency in the water, or is it, still maintaining about 3 times per week?
Yeah, I mean, again, the more times that you can swim a week, the better. So, as I said, and generally you have to assess to see if someone is actually struggling in the sense of maybe it's a shoulder issue from too much, because that's a new movement pattern, internal rotation, those sort of things. So I think you'd probably start at 2 times a week and then eventually go to three. And then as your body adapts to that movement pattern, and you're okay with the volume, because you're not going to swim probably an hour. You're probably going to start off swimming, say, 30, 40 minutes max. But as soon as you get to the point where you can swim roughly an hour, as a whole bunch of different drills and sort of content in that hour, then we can start maybe pushing past the 3 times per week. Normally, for an Ironman athlete, we usually recommend you get up to 12 kilometers in total of swimming per week. Of course, they might start at 6 in the early part of the season, like now. But as we get into July and August, just before the race season, they should be at 12 to 14 kilometers a week. So, but to answer your question, get in, that's fantastic. It's just one of those sports where it's non-weight bearing, so there's not a lot of risk there. It's just more about assessing to see if the athlete's shoulders are being able to handle that movement. And then from a coaching standpoint, we would try to teach you how to do some backstroke. So of course you're balancing off again that anterior front movement pattern with maybe a posterior movement pattern. So balancing out again the muscles that surround the joints. Yeah.
And how much time out? Like, say someone were to come to you tomorrow and say,
Mhm.
I'd like to be ready to go by Jan 1. Like, what's kind of the time frame that you expect an athlete to give into training before actually competing?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, a beginner triathlon, the sooner you start, the better, especially from the swimming department. But I find that if you're fairly athletic and you know how to swim, you probably want to give yourself at least 8 months before your first triathlon, just to be able to go through again the development in all three components, and then eventually go through that mid foundational standpoint where the volume comes up, and then eventually the last 6 to 8 weeks, which are really the most important timeframes before your goal race. That's where you get specific about race intensity, or putting swimming, biking, and running together, or doing linked workouts where you do a bike and a run, or a swim and a bike, and those sort of specifics. And then, of course, talking about the specifics about the race itself, transitions, and what it's like to potentially hyperventilate and the start of the swim, and how do you deal with that? Or is a better strategy to maybe wait for everyone to go, all the swimmers to go, and start off in a very calm fashion and build from there. So I would suggest that we definitely would need somewhere between 6 and 8 months, more if you're a real beginner. And then, of course, being very, very specific about that distance of your race. So in triathlons, you have sprint triathlons, or even super sprint triathlons, which are super short. Then you've got Olympic distance, or standard. And the standard distance is kind of what most people do. It's 1.5 kilometer swim, 40-kilometer bike, and a 10K run, which I find most people can get to that point in 1 year. Even if you're a beginner, you usually can get to that point. And I might want to just backtrack, is that swimming in a pool just with a swimsuit is more difficult than swimming in open water with a wetsuit, as you might know. The wetsuit gives you buoyancy, it gives you lift, it certainly eliminates some of the issues with body drag and that sort of thing. So I find, again, using a wetsuit makes things a little bit easier for a beginner swimmer or triathlete. So that's a beautiful thing to have that. And of course, in Canada, there's very rare that we have wetsuit or non-wetsuit swims. It's usually always with the wetsuit. Yeah, so that actually helps with the beginners to develop that. And then past the standard or Olympic distance triathlon, then there's the half Ironman, which again, the swim doesn't go up that much. It goes from 1,500 in the standard distance, And then the half Ironman, it goes to 2 kilometers. So it's only a 500-meter jump, which isn't too bad. But then this is where the land creature, the biker and the runner, starts to have an advantage, is that the bike is now 90 kilometers, which is quite lengthy, and the run is a half marathon. So now when you actually classify the 70.3 or half Ironman sort of distance, we're getting into what we would consider that ultra endurance time frame. So meaning that's somewhere beyond 5 hours. And so when you get into that time duration, you're looking at the sensitivity of nutrition, the sensitivity of pacing. Like if you go out too hard, it's going to really make it a difficult day. If you don't eat and drink in that 70.3 half Ironman, it's going to cause issues. And then once you go from 70.3, probably the finale in that so-called progression as a triathlete would be the full Ironman distance. And again, now we're looking at a 3.8 kilometer swim. So for most people, they're swimming, say, 90 minutes. Then they have a 180 kilometer bike ride. Most courses in Canada are quite hilly, so that's a difficult task. And then when you finish the bike, and this is all in one day, of course, you have a full marathon, 42 plus kilometers to run off the bike. And that's where things go sideways typically. So, the tiering would be start out with a sprint, gravitate to a standard distance, maybe in year one, keep going with the lifestyle. And then year two, potentially try your first 70.3 or half Ironman, and then to decide whether or not this is something that is really your jam. And then some people would take it to the next step and do a full Ironman. So that's probably the progression how an athlete would start into this triathlon world.
Love it. That is just a wealth of knowledge. I appreciate you sharing that. And one thing you touched on was the nutrition. Now, I'm really curious. I don't know how much you can talk about it, but let's talk a little bit about the importance of nutrition, like pre, post, intra nutrition for a triathlon athlete.
Yeah, obviously as an endurance athlete, the nutrition component is really important. For just day-to-day calorie intake, for instance, that matches the calorie expenditure. And that equation, as you know, it depends if you're trying to lean down or lose body fat mass. Then you want to have a slight negative on that. So a little bit more exertion, a little less intake, and then you tend to sort of lean down. Just on the side of that, this last summer, I was doing a lot of aerobic easy training, and I found that I didn't really get that lean, even with watching my diet. But as soon as I started to add some of that intensity, track workouts or hard intervals or more mountain biking, I found that I would lean down. And I'm not sure if that's a function of my age at 52, but certainly that's a component that we would implement into that. So that nutrition caloric intake expenditure is an important balance. And then, I think you just have to eat well. I don't think you have to be too crazy about it. Of course, we all like our emotional snacks and those sort of things. But you just need to be smart about that. Make sure that you get a variety of your vegetables in there. And then some people are vegan, some are not. You just got to make sure you get enough adequate protein for that so-called recovery, that muscle synthesis and enzymes and all the sort of adaptations that are going to happen as you go through a season of training for triathlon. And then, in the event itself, the most important substrate is basically carbohydrates, or the simplest form is sugar. But the longer, again, we go into the endurance side, meaning you go from standard Olympic distance triathlon to that half Ironman to finally that full Ironman, the nutrition during the event becomes even more important. And that's where you have to kind of work with someone specifically and say, okay, these are the things that I like. Potentially it could be all liquid diet, and that's what I use for a 70.3 half Ironman. But as we go into the full day Ironman, you're out there for 12 to 15 hours. typically you're going to have some sort of solid food in there. So again, working with the athlete specifically, some say, well, I just want a peanut butter and jam sandwich. Well, that might be something that works for them. And then maybe saying 50% of their calorie intake will be liquid. So again, that's an art, working with someone and kind of deciding what food sources and how many calories per hour is important. And then obviously the recovery standpoint, there's more research out on the recovery. We used to say that you have a window of, say, 20 minutes after a hard workout to ingest something. That's not necessarily the case. If you can do that, that's great. That I would have to say, though, that if you have multiple workouts in the day, then I think you would want to try to ingest some calories and hydration probably immediately after your workout, knowing that, say, within the next 2 hours, you have another workout session. But I think the human body is pretty smart about trying to take its needed components, macronutrients, micronutrients, vitamins, minerals. It can draw out certain things that it needs. And I don't think we need to be too specific about and write and document everything that we eat, as long as, again, we're covering the scope of carbohydrates, proteins, essential fats, and eating properly. And then again, the big question is are you trying to lean down a little bit? I know in the winter we're not worried about that, but as an endurance athlete, that strength to mass ratio really makes a difference, and the lighter that you are without necessarily developing ill health symptoms and signs, the better you're going to be in the endurance realm.
That's incredible. I think that's really good to hear too, that, you just do your best. Obviously, when you're doing this, you don't necessarily need to log everything in the book, but I love to hear that kind of approach, and people know what they're doing when they go through this. And maybe if they just need that extra help and coaching go through that, that's wicked. That's awesome to hear. One thing I did want to touch on itself is let's talk about recovery. Let's talk about, how would somebody after a tough workout, or, just how would you coach them to recover? Foam rolling, sleep, hydration. What kind of direction do you take there?
Yeah, you hit it right on the nose. Sleep is the most important thing. Restful sleep, good quality sleep. So that's where a lot of the rebuilding happens. And then beyond that, if you're a good sleeper, then that's great. You have to develop, again, the routine and the techniques of being able to sleep well. And beyond that, you look at potentially sort of the adequate intake of protein. There are certain amino acids that are important, and now there's one or two now that are the limitations per se, in building, again, that muscle mass or connective tissue. And so in general, I usually just try to recommend that people get, something that's high in protein, at least within the hour, maybe 2 hours post workout. And it depends on the magnitude of the workout. So we now, as a group, we start doing these indoor bike run, they call them brick workouts. We do them at Mount Royal University here in Calgary. And the first initial duration is 3 hours, but we build up to 5 hours. And so coming off of 5-hour hard workout on a Sunday morning, certainly after that, we're going to be in a position that we want to have a good meal. And that just means that basically we're going to have all the components as part of that intake. So carbohydrates, obviously protein, you're going to hydrate adequately. In the session itself, we should be promoting hydration anyways. But the latest research is now telling us that some of these ultra endurance training sessions, we actually do almost fasted. And so you might have read up on that. Now there's some research that's pointing out and saying, you know what, if we want to be an efficient endurance athlete, the primary fuel is fat. That's basically burning for us to, of course, do these 4 to 12-hour or 14-hour events. Now, fat basically is this big piece of wood or log, and in order to ignite it, you need a little bit of kindling, and that's your carbohydrate. So you still need a little bit of carbohydrate coming in to ignite the fat, but that's what those longer workout sessions do. They start to train that whole metabolic system to burn adequate fat. And again, latest research is now saying that in a fasted state where you minimize that intake of carbohydrate, you can make the efficiency of fat burning higher. And that's a good thing. And then there's now research that's saying that we can actually enhance the development at the peripheral level, at the muscle site, with the mitochondria and the capillarization, even in a fasted state. So most of these so-called 3, 4, and 5 hour brick workouts, I personally do them fasted. And inside that workout, I actually don't ingest a lot of fuel. I actually chew gum. I'll drink liquid or some electrolyte drink, but not a lot of calories coming in. So there is some specific science to sort of developing your physiology for ultra endurance in sport, in this case triathlon. Now that doesn't mean you're going to go into your race fasted. That's certainly not what we're practicing. We're actually doing this sort of more in the off season. So again, that's a little bit more advanced protocol or coaching, but in general, we're trying to get people so that they're super efficient with working with fuel and extending that endurance capacity so that, again, you don't reach that fatigue state before so-called the finish line. Yeah.
Wow, that's great. And you mentioned sleep, you mentioned hydration, you mentioned nutrition. Is there anything else like, I don't know, cold baths or anything to that effect that you would kind of supplement in terms of recovery?
Yeah, and that's good. I'm glad you reminded me of this. So there are some of these modalities out there that a lot of people have been doing. So like you said, cold baths. Well, I just recently went to a conference, it was last year, and they showed that, cold baths don't necessarily enhance the recovery. It may actually be suppressing the inflammation. And we know that inflammation is one of the first steps for your body to actually go through that adaptation phase. And so there's a lot of debate out there right now of whether or not we should be using these compression leg devices, to try to reduce inflammation. And maybe it was 10 or 15 years ago, many people were taking sort of anti-inflammatory aids, Advils or those sort of things after workouts. And then they eventually realized, no, we're actually doing our body a disservice, right? So we're sort of going down that pathway and realizing that, yeah, it's easy to load the body. It's easy to stress it with the training. But now we don't want to necessarily short circuit the body in the recovery standpoint. And that's sometimes what some of these devices and things do. The cold baths I like only because, say, for instance, after a hard workout or after a hard race, a cold bath reduces the the core temperature, which allows you typically to take a nap or sleep. That's what I found. So I've done many of these 6-day, 7-day stage endurance races. And so after, 5 hours of pounding out in the mountains, whether it's running or cycling, mountain biking, we have a routine. And normally what I would try to do is get off, finish the race, get some nutrition in, clean my bike, that sort of thing. But normally I would maybe get to a cold stream just to reduce that hot flash, that heat that you've generated from the race, but it allows me to actually take a nap. And I think sleep is the number one thing for recovery. And if you're a bad sleeper, or if you're a shift worker where you're nights and then days, like that is a nightmare for an endurance athlete, because again, sleep is the most important. And in terms of, you mentioned rolling, again, fascial release, all those sort of things. As an endurance athlete, you will get tight. You will have your skeletal system might come out of its alignment and that sort of stuff. So you do need to have, I guess, this group of people that are supporting you to keep healthy, chiropractor, physiotherapy, those sort of things, because it's inevitably going to happen. But I mean, again, the rolling side of things, again, the latest research is it tends to be a mute point. If you feel like that loosens you up, then that's great, but it's not necessarily stretching the fascia. It might be giving you a little bit mobility through the muscle itself, but in that regard, you could just do targeted stretching and that sort of stuff. So I guess in some senses, of 30 years of coaching, we've seen a lot of things come down the pipe, but eventually we're realizing that those things were insignificant per se, or sometimes doing more harm than good. So I think really the fundamentals are still the same. 20, 30 years ago, a lot of stuff is still the same. And those are the things that I speak with Dr. Dave Smith. I've got a meeting with him on Monday. And we sort of go down that alley to find out what's new, what works. Is there scientific research that supports that? Because again, you truly want to give advice that's proven, that's safe, that definitely will get them from A to Z without any issues. And so that's kind of my job.
That's incredible. I love that. I'd like to know too, how much of the training is scientific and how much is anecdotal?
Yeah, the scientific research is pretty fundamental. Like, I mean, we always, as a physiologist, look at the relationship between duration and intensity. And beyond that, we do an assessment of what basically is the goal. So in triathloning is what distance are they training for? And from that, we know that roughly what is the duration and the intensity. So specificity is an important concept. So really, it's just a matter of doing that assessment and then implementing the right type of training stress, and that's about as simple as it is. And we all know that to become a superior athlete, consistency is critical. So in that big word of consistency, it assumes that you're healthy. So how do you maintain your health? So health is a big thing. So are you working in a job where you tend to get colds, viruses, and those sort of things, where you have to be super careful about not necessarily suppressing your immune system? And we know that physical stress suppresses your immune system, as does normal, day-to-day life stress. So in that, that identifies a person that may be like a lawyer who goes through a lot of day-to-day stresses. How much training load should we give them so that they remain healthy? And that's really a huge art, is just figuring out what training load an athlete needs. And like you said, from that training load, find out where the weaknesses are. So like you said, maybe we need to do 3-4 times the swims a week and really keep the running and the biking on the back burner until 2 months into the program. So sort of a roundabout way of sort of explaining it, but it does come down to the specifics of the person that we're working with, for sure. Yeah.
Love it. I love that. And I do want to touch back on something you mentioned at the very beginning. You mentioned that you've worked with people who have climbed Mount Everest. I gotta know,
Hmm.
how is that? What is that like? Can you talk about some of the people that you've worked with?
Yeah.
And yeah, take it away.
Yeah. The first thing, obviously I've never climbed Mount Everest. I haven't done a lot of high altitude sort of climbing sort of things. So the first thing I had to do is really do a complete analysis of, the 6 days that they're in Nepal, and sort of what is the physical demands, not to mention the environmental demands. In this case, they're at high altitude. They're doing vertical gain. They're in a situation where obviously one wrong move and they're basically, they risk their lives. And so that was the big thing, is to really do what they call a sport analysis. And then beyond that would be to create a training program that targeted the specifics, the muscles, the movement patterns, those sort of things. But in this case, the most important thing was to be able to build what I call a summit cycle. And so it just means that, if it was going to be a 6-day push to the summit and back down, I tried to create miniature summit cycles building through a 2-year plan, so that they're starting to get used to what it's going to be like when they actually get to Mount Everest. And so that's kind of what I did. And then beyond that, obviously most of it was climbing, most of it was sort of aerobic work, but we needed to be in the mountains. And so that's where snowshoeing became our mode of apparatus. We did it. We actually snowshoed a lot in the cold, because one big component would be to figure out, make sure that you've got the proper gear so you don't get cold, so that the gear is going to work pretty well at high altitude, that there's no messing around with it. You can't necessarily at 26,000 feet take your glove off and fix your jacket or any of that stuff. It just doesn't work. So that was one of my most, I would say, complicated tasks. And again, just with my education, I was able to kind of break it down into the things that I needed to do. And then I actually went out and did a lot of the training with these two people, Alan Hobson and Jamie Clark. Jamie Clark was the 9th Canadian to climb Everest, and Alan Hobson was the 10th. And I actually went out and trained with them quite a bit. So it was really neat doing sort of that groundwork. And then the last component, we knew that their summit day, as they went from advanced base camp up to the summit and back down, that could have been somewhere around a 12-hour day. So I would start incorporating these days where they're out there moving for almost 20 to 24 hours. So in that sleep deprivation state is very, very difficult to keep going. And so we had to incorporate that into their training. So, but it was an awesome task. And as I said, it's quite a feat to help these people climb the tallest mountain in the world.
I love that. I love to hear it. You've worked with some Olympians as well.
Yeah, the Olympians, Carol Montgomery, Jill Savage, these people, again, specifically in the sport of Olympic triathlons. It was really great working with these two athletes. they're, it's funny because Carol Montgomery was one of the fastest female runners in the world, and she nearly won the world championships in triathlon. And then Jill Savage was kind of more of a swimmer. She was a great swimmer, so she would always come out of the water in the top pack, and then capable of obviously riding with the top girls. And then her run was really strong as well. So again, working with such elite sort of athletes, you really have to be very detailed about what you give these people for their training, and then being specific about their so-called last 6 weeks leading into the big races. And so the Olympic Games is probably the most prestigious competition. Every 4 years you have one opportunity to be at your best. And so when you think of the amount of pressure and stress that's related to that, giving them a program and they're trusting you, there is a tremendous amount of stress associated with that. And obviously, being there to talk to them before the racing and just keeping them calm and then allowing them to go out and execute. So it was quite a journey, as I said. And it's just, again, one of those things in life where you realize, you've been a part of a big picture, and it's not everybody's world. Not everybody wants to make it to the Olympics per se, but most people want to reach their so-called potential. They want to reach, what is my potential in endurance sport? And again, that's where I pretty much work with them from step one all the way to the finale. And along the way, there's lots of things that we can work on.
What is your proudest moment as a coach?
I think it may not be working with these high performance athletes, although that's very satisfying. It's more about working with an athlete that's maybe come from, say, cancer or ill health, or being extremely overweight. And what I'm proud about is just people that really commit. That's the biggest thing. So someone that's super committed, that does the work, not necessarily looking for that external praise. It's more about their own journey, and just seeing how tough and dedicated they are. That makes me really happy, and being a part of that. And I'm very proud for people that are like that. And most of my clients or athletes are internally driven. Like they certainly want to get to that point, and that's coming within. I don't necessarily have to be on the phone and saying, okay, you got to get up, you got to do this, you got to do that. That's not really my style, because I find it's just so much more refreshing to work with someone that is keen. And so I would say working with that athlete is probably the most rewarding. It's probably taking them from, again, a state of ill health all the way to a point where they're extremely healthy and potentially maybe doing something that they never thought was possible. And you can just see the joy, and the change in them is just phenomenal. And that probably gives me the most satisfaction. Yeah.
I mean, you've worked with people high performance. You've worked with maybe someone who's been a little bit overweight, and I'm curious, how much does the mind play into this?
Yeah, the mind is huge. I mean, just from the day-to-day routine, absolutely. When does it end? And again, in this environment of COVID, the mind is even more important. I mean, we're all struggling with the ups and downs, the daily grind, and the restrictions. But I find when you reach into high performances, or you're trying to, again, better your own performance, the mind plays a big role. And specifically, I know that for myself. I think one of the things that my biggest asset is my mental toughness. And just in, I think it was a year and a half ago at the World Xterra Championships, I was coming off the bike and I was 3 minutes behind or so in a race. And it was all about, am I willing to go into that world of hurt, and that's mental. Are you willing to so-called accept that uncomfortable, and that it's not pain, it's that uncomfortable feeling of racing and knowing that you can keep pushing, and the closer you get to the finish line, the harder you push, and really that's just a skill set. And sometimes in training, I give my athletes a very difficult workout. So, and really it's the physical side is there, but it's more about, can they embrace the discomfort that's associated with that workout. And so training the mind and that pain tolerance, and I guess the way that we deal with that is very, very important, especially in endurance events. So for instance, I've got an athlete that's racing in Kelowna this year on these backyard ultras, and it's insane what they do. So they have roughly around 7.6 kilometers to run, and they have to finish that distance in the hour. So, and every hour they have to go back on a loop, and there's no finish line. It's the last person standing. You can go 36 hours. So, that to me is 80%, 90% mental, 10% physical. And so depending upon, again, on that continuum of endurance, the longer that endurance event goes, the more it is mental. It's just a tough grind. And I wish Myron a lot of success this weekend, but it's going to be a long weekend for those guys.
Calvin, I want to know, who are some people in the endurance field right now, like some athletes out there that, are doing good things? A name that comes to mind, and this is just me, it's someone who's not in, but like David Goggins. I don't know if you're familiar with him or anything, but he's putting out messages just about how, you do have to endure and you do have to push through. So tell me about some people that you really admire in the field.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of people now. It's kind of about who's more of a presence in the social media side of things nowadays, that who have the platform to reach, again, the audiences out there that are snooping around on the social media. I mean, most of my mentors are sort of the old school people, from athletes like Dave Scott, the triathlete, or Phil Maffetone, for instance, is a scientist that developed this concept of low heart rate training and measuring the speed that you can run at a certain heart rate. And those guys are still more my mentors, basically, because I think, again, in speaking with my professor, Doc Dave Smith, is that most of the training concepts haven't changed. It's more about packaging them up. And again, it's just more about, putting some fling and flair into these sort of things, right? But when it really comes down to communicating with the athletes, most often it's more about, okay, this is more about your consistency and hard work. And so I don't really necessarily go out and find one group. There is I guess a large body of nutrition sports scientists out there that I went to a conference with, and there's several of them. Like, it's not just one person. Nowadays, I think a lot of these world-class leaders in certain aspects of performance are all coming together now, and they're actually starting to come up with this so-called summary of what works and what doesn't. And so it's not just one person, I think. Again, it's just being very aware of where these groups or people are, or where these seminars are being hosted, and being a part of that. And so there are several Canadians, for instance, in Victoria, that work at the Pacific Sports Center Institute that specialize in altitude training, for instance, and how to get the most out of altitude training, and if you're what they call a responder or a non-responder. And again, these are the people that I will sit and watch and listen to a podcast and sort of draw upon some of the concepts that I think will be important for maybe a small group of my clients. And then again, there are people out there that are specifying in women in nutrition. As you know, their needs are a little bit different. So I can't really say that there's one person that has it all, but it's my job to kind of do the work and find the specific science-based experienced people and researchers, take that information and start plugging it into my specific client base. So yeah, and there's a lot of great books out there. There's tons on multi-sport, endurance training, whether it's biking or running or swimming or any of those sort of things. So yeah, I don't really have anybody that's specific. Alex Hutchison wrote a book. I think it's amazing. There's so many good people out there that are starting to compile it. But what you really need to make sure of is that if the person that you're studying under, you got to make sure that they've done their homework, that they're actually supporting it with science or supporting it with their own experience, and then drawing upon that, and then asking the question: is this pseudoscience? Is it just testimonial stuff? Is it really accurate? And that's where I really invite people to really take a hard look of what the source is, and from there on you can make a choice, or you can implement it and decide if it works for you or not. Especially the confusion that's in the nutrition side of things. Yeah.
Love it. Thank you so much for clearing that up too, because sometimes it's not the people who are loudest, it's the people who are quietest that are doing the best things. So I think that that's really important to do your research if you're obviously looking to, you know, go on any sort of journey. I think that's really important.
Yeah.
One final question here. I want to be respectful for your time. This has been great so far. Just a wealth of like so much information. I think a lot of people are going to get a lot of value out of this. Let's talk about your top 40, under 40. I want to give you a little bit of props there, a little bit of credit. Congratulations, first off, for achieving that. But tell me about the honor that was bestowed on you back in 2006.
Yeah, I actually got a phone call from an organization that obviously I was nominated by. I'm not even really even sure. It might have been Alan Hobson who climbed Mount Everest, and I was nominated for so-called a bit more of a founder in the aspect of developing a service that you know, allows people to do this sport and wellness sort of side of things. And so again, as I was one of the founding area companies that started doing it, and I guess that's pretty much what they were recognizing, is that I was a leader in that fitness endurance field and offering a service to the community of Calgary. And then within that, like again, working with Alan Hobson and Jamie Clark to climb Mount Everest, and then I was working with cancer rehab. So people that have gone through chemotherapy and radiation, they're in what they call a dysfunctional state. It's very, very difficult for them to do normal, tasks, walking upstairs or going to the grocery store and getting groceries and stuff. And so myself and Dr. David Smith, we were developing a protocol of exercise to help take them from a dysfunctional state to somewhat of a normalcy state. It's hard to get there, but we developed an exercise protocol using blood lactates and loading and that sort of thing. And I think that was really a big component, again, to that award and just some of the things that I was doing. And it was groundbreaking. Like, that was brand new. And of course, we published a paper that addressed that. And again, just contributing to the community. And in this case, it was more to these cancer survivors who, we know that 1 in 4, of course, may go down that road. So it was just sort of that groundbreaking contribution, again, to not only Calgary, but pretty much across the country and the world. So it was an honor to obviously be presented with that top 40 under 40, and yeah, it was really neat.
Well, congratulations. You're doing amazing things. I mean, you mentioned that you've been doing this for nearly 30 years, but I mean, I would like to know how you were 30 years ago. You've got a lot of energy right now. I mean, you can just tell your passion, and I want to acknowledge you for that. I want to acknowledge you for, continuing to help your community and continuing to help people just excel to the best version of themselves, whether they're high performance Olympians or whether they're someone that's recovering from cancer. I just want to acknowledge you, and I'm grateful for people like you that continue to do that. So thank you so much. While I've still got you here, why don't we talk a little bit more about where people can find you, Critical Speed, where can they get more information?
Yeah, thank you, Justin. I appreciate your kind words. Yeah, Critical Speed is my website, or you can just Google Coach Cal, Calgary. You'll find me, of course, and my email address is on there. And again, we're just starting up our winter season. So if people are out there and they want to do their first triathlon in 2021 or 2022 for that matter, we're doing swimming, we're doing biking, we're doing running, we're doing those brick workouts, we're doing biking and running and core and conditioning and that sort of thing. Or if you're kind of wondering about what it takes in order to get into that first endurance event, whether it's running marathons and that sort of stuff, people can reach out, send me an email. I can give them some direction. I help people buy bicycles. I mean, set up equipment. Sometimes it's very confusing. And so all of that, I pretty much will help people. I'm the quarterback behind people's projects. So yeah, criticalspeed.com, Coach Cal, you can find me, reach out at any time. And again, I am welcoming lots of different people to come in and join, and you might be, again, running with a person that has done 3 Ironmans, and you can ask them questions. And again, it develops this beautiful social networking. And then now, again, with COVID, half of my so-called delivery is sort of via social media, Zoom, those sort of things. And so we can still social distance and achieve, again, that continuous planned out training protocol as we go into this so-called winter season. And eventually, hopefully, we'll have a good spring and summer for 2021.
Anything else you want to add while I still have you here?
Yeah, no, I love what you're doing. I love the podcast. I like the aspect of you bringing in specialists for us to again get our message out there. I think what you're doing is a fantastic service to the community, and I commend you on that. And I hope it continues to grow. And of course, I'd love to be back at any time. If you ever want to do another sort of podcast or put a panel together, we should do it.
Love it. Thank you so much for your time today. Hang on the call for just a second. I'm going to stop the recording here.
Thanks, Justin.